So hopefully you're seeing this. We are having some technical difficulties today. If not, you'll be able to catch the recording later on Facebook or YouTube. So namaste friends, welcome to the second episode of our series on the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. For those of you who are joining live, thank you for tuning in. And if you're watching this later on Facebook or YouTube, do let me know if you have any comments or feedback or question, and I'll make sure to address them in the next episode or the upcoming episodes of the series. So last week we looked at the very first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, the first verse where it all began, that question that Sanjaya asked the King Dhritarashtra, that conversation between the blind mind and introspection. And after the last episode, I myself was thinking what I was going to pick next, and also I had a question from someone asking if there would be a roadmap for this series, wondering what are all the different verses I'll be looking at and in what order, because I did not make that clear. As I was thinking about it, I realized there's a lot of logic in the way Vyasa has sequenced the scripture, the different chapters and the progression of ideas. So it's more than likely that I'm going to stick to one chapter and look at some of the important verses and my favorite ones and explain and talk about them before moving on to the next idea. But, however, today is going to be an exception because today happens to be a special day. I'm speaking to you, if you're watching this live, on April 21st, 2020. This day, April 21st, we celebrate as the moksha anniversary of Swami Kriyananda. I'm speaking to you from the Ananda community in Palo Alto, and this is a day that we celebrate across all Ananda communities around the world. For those of you who don't know, Swami Kriyananda is the founder of Ananda. To tell you a little bit more about myself, in case you did not realize, I am a disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. And I discovered the spiritual path, or rather I should say I discovered the path of Kriya Yoga when I read the autobiography of a yogi. This was many years ago. I was, I think, 23 years at that time. And immediately I had this deep awareness that I should follow the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. I was drawn to it magnetically. And right after that, I started meditating and I started practicing the teachings and learning more about the path of Kriya Yoga. And a couple of years later, I moved to the US. I came to the San Francisco Bay Area around the end of 2011, which is when I discovered the Ananda communities, and I was able to, I had the good fortune of meeting Swami Kriyananda, who I consider a close friend, a guide, a teacher for me spiritually. And this was the day on April 21st, 2013 that he left his body. So this day we all celebrate as moksha anniversary, that day when he was freed from earthly bondage. So the verse that I'm going to talk about today has a lot to do with that. I was meditating on what would be a good verse to honor and celebrate this day and also share the teachings of Bhagavad Gita with all of you. So the verse that I'm going to explain and talk about today is from the second chapter. It's the 48th verse of the second chapter. The second chapter, for those of you who know, is a chapter where Krishna is speaking with Arjuna, and he's explaining a lot about karma yoga, the nature of right action in this world. And the verse goes like this: Yogastaha kuru karmani sangam tyaktva dhananjaya siddhi asiddhyoho samo bhutva samatvam yoga uchyate. And I'm going to give you the literal translation of the verse. O Dhananjaya Arjuna, immerse yourself in the thought of yoga, inwardly non-attached and even-minded in both success and failure. Perfect evenness of mind and feeling is the definition of yoga. So I'll come to it in a little bit as to why I picked this verse for today, and I want to talk a little bit about the life and teachings of Swami Kriyananda. But even before that, this verse comes at a very interesting and a very core part of the second chapter in the Gita, where Krishna is describing to Arjuna this philosophy of karma yoga. The Bhagavad Gita itself is perhaps the most authoritative treatise on the subject of yoga. Perhaps some of you are familiar, and we are going to explore a lot of this in the upcoming episodes. Krishna talks in detail and clarifies to a great extent to Arjuna what yoga is. Karma yoga, how do you perform duties in the world without attachment? How do you practice devotion, bhakti yoga? What is meditation? How do you meditate the right way? How do you draw your energy in? And what is discrimination? Jnana yoga. How do you practice wisdom and how do you apply that in your life? So Krishna is giving very detailed and very clear instructions to Arjuna as he is facing this battle. So a lot of what we are looking at in the Bhagavad Gita is an explanation of the system of yoga and how we practice it in our life. The very famous line that Krishna tells to Arjuna is Bhidava Yogi. So the entire Gita, as we can understand, is teaching us this practice of yoga. Now, in this particular verse, Krishna gives a definition of yoga. The verse right before this 247 is in fact a more popular verse. For those of you who perhaps grew up with this or have studied the Gita, it's the verse that starts with Karmanyeva Dhikaraste. That's the verse where Krishna is explaining to Arjuna what Karma Yoga is. He basically tells Arjuna, you have to do your duties, you have to act in this world, but the fruits of those actions do not belong to you. If you have to avoid suffering, if you want to avoid suffering, give me all those fruits. Your duty is only to act. So that is an extremely core teaching of the Bhagavad Gita, especially for Arjuna going into the war, but that is the message that Krishna is giving to all of us. And in this verse, right after that, Krishna is defining yoga for Arjuna. He says, perfect evenness of mind and feeling is the definition of yoga. And evenness both during success and failure, no matter what comes to you in your life, being perfectly detached from the outcome of whatever the circumstances are in your own life. That is yoga. Now, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is also another scripture that Yogananda spoke a lot about and he gave a lot of explanations for, the second verse of that scripture, Patanjali defines yoga for us. He says, Yogaha chitta vritti nirodha. And again, there are a lot of ways in which this particular verse is translated. The way Yogananda described it, or he translated it, is yoga is a neutralization of the vortices of feeling. Oftentimes in many translations I have seen the word mind used there, and Yogananda refrained from using the word mind in explaining this particular verse of Patanjali. And I'll tell you why. Because the way Yogananda defined or translated the word chitta is the primordial feeling nature, which is the essence of who we are as conscious beings. That feeling is what underlies everything else that we experience, the mind, the thoughts, our own ego identity. All of that are like layers on top of that fundamental feeling nature. In fact, that is why the Indian scriptures describe God as Satchidananda, or perfect bliss, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. And if you think about it, bliss is feeling. Bliss is not a thought. Bliss is not an idea. The only way we can understand bliss or experience it is if we could feel it. So that feeling nature is fundamental to everything else that we experience in our consciousness. And when Patanjali is talking about chitta, he's talking about that primordial feeling nature. And he says vritti, he uses the word vritti, which literally means a vortex. And I'm not going to explain this in this particular video because that would be a whole other conversation of the Yoga Sutras. But what the word vritti means in this second Yoga Sutra is that vortex, all those impressions, all those things that we hold in our astral spine, things that we hold from the past, all our likes and dislikes, our regrets and longing and fear and anxieties and hopes and desires, all of that that we hold, which are drawing energy out. And these vortices of feeling are really what are causing our energy to go out into the world. And Patanjali describes yoga as a neutralization of these vortices of feeling. And it is the same idea that Krishna is presenting to Arjuna. perfect evenness of mind and feeling. Because what we are working with is to take away everything that is not, excuse me, take away everything that is not part of our true essence, that is not part of our fundamental nature, and what is left is that perfect neutral evenness of that soul, that experience of bliss. It is anything but nothingness. It is in fact a pure expression of joy, of that experience of cosmic consciousness. And how do you manifest in this world? In his explanation for this verse, Swami Kriyananda makes a distinction. This evenness that Krishna is talking about is not a positive affirmation. In fact, immediately following this in the Gita, we are not going to discuss these verses today, Arjuna asks Krishna, so how do I know how to practice this? Who are those wise people? What does it look like when somebody is perfectly even, when somebody is practicing this science of yoga? And then Krishna goes on to explain, he describes who Sthita Prajna is, or one who's established in wisdom. And then he gives an explanation for who a Muni is, or a great sage. And then he says a Muni or a sage is somebody who is not affected by anything that comes to him, whether it's success or failure, exactly the definition that he gives in this verse. But more importantly, he goes on to say that great sage, the Muni, the way you know a Muni, or the definition of being a sage, is that you're able to withdraw from your senses all your energy, just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs into the shell. Now, this is a perfect image. Sometimes I read these scriptures, especially some of the Hindu scriptures, and I look at those images. The tortoise withdrawing its limbs into the shell, or the water droplet on a lotus leaf, how no matter how many thousands of years ago the scripture was first shared, you can still relate to it. You can still see the tortoise just drawing its legs and hands, or its legs rather, into its shell. And that is that key to perfect evenness. Because as Swami Kriyananda explains in his commentary on this verse, this state cannot be achieved by merely thinking about it with the mind. We cannot simply say, no matter what happens, I'm just going to remain calm. We can try, and we should try. This is not a discouragement for practicing right attitude. We should certainly make our best effort, no matter what's coming in life, to stay perfectly even-minded. But that does not always work, because we do not have complete control over that feeling faculty, which has been outworked by all these vortices that exist in our spine. So what is the solution? The solution is to draw the energy in, the practice of meditation, to be able to focus our attention at this point, the spiritual eye, and to be able to withdraw those senses back into the spine. And when we start doing that, we naturally start dissolving and neutralizing those vortices. And then perfect evenness of mind and feeling becomes a state of consciousness. It is no longer an affirmation. So that's really what Krishna is telling Arjuna. In this particular verse, he is introducing this idea, he is defining yoga, but later on, there's a lot of exposition that Krishna gives on what meditation is, what dhyana is, how do you practice. In fact, he even makes a reference to how you work with your breath, which is the science of Kriya Yoga, which I will talk about in a later episode. But in this verse, we learn what yoga is and how Krishna is describing it to Arjuna. Now, I want to talk about why I picked this verse for today. Last night I was meditating on some of the verses in the Gita and thinking about what would be the most appropriate one to share on this special day. And this verse came to me because a lot of verses in the Gita, Swami Kriyananda being my own dear friend, guide and teacher, he was an exemplary role model for a lot of ideas that Krishna presents in the Gita. And this particular verse, this idea of being perfectly detached and being a yogi by demonstrating perfect calmness of mind and feeling, I thought was so related to the life of Swami Kriyananda, what he demonstrated for all of us throughout the various circumstances that he went through in his own life. For those of you who know anything about Swami Kriyananda, his life was one of great trials. It was not by any stretch an easy life. And a lot of what happened and how he dealt with it was a lesson for all of us. In fact, I am in a rather unique position talking about all of this because unlike many others who you might have heard speak, or a lot of experienced teachers and leaders in the Ananda communities like Asha or Jyotish and Devi and others who spent many years in close company with Swami Kriyananda, being trained by him and mentored by his company, I, for one, did not have much personal contact with Swami Kriyananda at all. I came to Ananda and I became part of this community very late in Swami Kriyananda's life. And I could probably count with my fingers the number of times I was physically present in his company, which was, I would say, probably 6 or 7 times. And I was present in a talk or in a room where he was sharing something, and I was perhaps blessed by him a couple of times. But there was no personal conversation. We did not sit and talk about my own personal life, or he did not offer to me any personal advice or counsel that I can hold on to. But I do remember, even from those brief exchanges, or even from those brief interactions or those experiences, the powerful impressions that I had, how just his mere presence in the room would lift your consciousness, because he was always living in that perfect state of calmness. I remember this one time, this was perhaps the very first time when I was standing in a line to receive blessings from Swami Kriyananda, and this was at Ananda village, which is 4 hours from where I live in Palo Alto. And I don't know how many people were there, but it felt like there were thousands of people. We were all gathered in his home, which is called Crystal Hermitage, and we were all outdoors, and he was sitting in a chair, and people were lining up to go meet him and be blessed by him. And I remember approaching him. The whole scene was one of, I would say, chaos. I was looking for a better word, but it was fairly chaotic. There were people trying to get to Swami Kriyananda, to touch his feet, to get his blessing. There were so many that would just sit in random places all over, meditating all around Swami Kriyananda. And there were others who were running around fixing food, trying to coordinate, manage all the people walking in and out. So it was just overwhelming for me, but especially it was a very small space. I'm from India, so I'm used to crowds, but this was just a whole other level of chaos and confusion, because everybody was doing something all around. And when I approached Swami Kriyananda, when I got physically close to him, it was so apparent to me how he was so unaffected by all of this. And later on, Asha Nai Swami, she shared something that Swami Kriyananda had said in his life, especially much later in his life when all of this was building around him. When any time he entered a room, there was so much happening, because there was so much energy swirling around him. He said, "I see the myth of Swami Kriyananda swirling around me." I find that such a fascinating idea even to meditate on, how this personality, how all the things that we are attached to and identify with, how all of this is merely a myth that is swirling around us. Well, I don't have hundreds of people swirling around me, but I do have all these worries and hopes and desires and anxieties and anticipation and all of this constantly swirling around me. The myth of being in this body and of living this life and identifying with this form, it's always swirling around me. Another time, Swami Kriyananda said, "I consider Swami Kriyananda an event that I'm responsible for." What a beautiful way to look at it. Talk of detachment, detaching from everything that is outward and identifying with that pure soul nature of who we are. Swami Kriyananda's life was a demonstration of all of this. Success or failure, he was perfectly even-minded. There were years of persecution and lawsuit that he had to personally go through. And it was interesting for those that were close to him to see how he went through all of it, because he was also human on one level, but he was at all times connected to a part of himself that was untouched by what was happening around him. That, Krishna says to Arjuna, is the definition of a sage, of a muni, who is able to detach from all that is outward, from all the success and failure, and his consciousness is so united with the greater consciousness that it is not affected. It is not affected by all these outward circumstances. No matter what's coming to him in his life, he doesn't have to discipline himself to say, be joyful or be happy. He is simply always in touch with that joy that is inherent to the essence of who we are as humans, our own connection with the divine. And that's really what Swami Kriyananda displayed for all of us. So I hope on this special day you find inspiration through his life. We have programs planned for you today. In 15 minutes from now, no matter where you're watching, Facebook or live stream, Ashanai Swami will share her thoughts on living with Swami Kriyananda and this special day and the lessons that he shared with us through his life. And today evening at 7:30 p.m., again on these same platforms, we will have a special celebration that will be an online program that will be broadcast. Hope you can all join us. It will include a lot of music, video tributes, and talks on Swami Kriyananda's life. And I hope to speak to you next week, and we will go back to the first chapter and look at a few more verses before moving on to second chapter and discussing this topic further. Thank you all for joining, and God bless you.